Luke 10:25-26. And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tempted him, saying, Master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said unto him, What is written in the law? How readest thou?
How readest thou? That was good. Okay, welcome to Searching the Sacred, everyone. Lisa, Steph, and Jason here with you. And we are in a series where we are just kind of trying to do something a little different. Our normal MO, our modus operandi, is that we dive into a passage of Scripture, we unpack it. So if you want some of that, I would say go back into the archives of this podcast and check out the way we dance and wrestle with different passages of Scripture. But this season, we're kind of unpacking how do we read this and what does it say? Really, trying to answer or kind of work within these framework that Jesus provided us with this verse in Luke chapter 10. And Lisa's been reading from a different translation every week to kind of give us some nuance to this conversation. And today, we're going to be kind of taking it down another path. And so we've talked a little bit about hermeneutics last week. And so we're going to kind of continue that conversation today. And so, Lisa, I'm just going to get us started by asking you, what translation was that?
That was the good old King James Version.
And it wasn't the New King James? It was just the King James?
That's the legit King James Version.
How readest thou?
That's the one that gets handed down in my family. That is the translation that was read at Sunday lunches and at church.
Wait, Sunday lunches? What do you mean by Sunday lunches?
Oh, because you go to church, then you go to Grandpa and Grandma's house and have like lunch, then you go back to church in the evening.
So wait, at Sunday lunch though, they would be reading from the King James Version around your table?
Yeah. Didn't you read the Bible at every meal?
No. I'm starting to feel like evangelical shame though, like I should have been. Like, am I going to go to hell now because we didn't read the Bible around every meal in the original King James?
Only the holiest read the King James.
It's just I can hear all the men in my family. I can hear the voices on both sides. Like I can hear my dad's voice too. Like this is the translation of my upbringing.
Well, and I think it's really appropriate to have read that one today to notice like how does a translation affect how we hear a text? It came up last time and we thought this really deserves its own episode of like thinking about the translations we read and how that affects how we hear things. And so how did it feel to everybody like listening to King James as compared to a few episodes ago when you did the First Nations Bible? Like that's a super different translation of the same passage.
I feel like this also is like the translation conversation also links to inerrancy because when I was growing up, the King James Version was the only translation. This was the word. This was directly how it was handed down. And you didn't veer outside of it because then you were like messing around.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a particular way that I don't know and I don't know how it shifted. Like something did shift inside the Christian narrative. But I feel like that came in growing up, what it happened when like, God, sometimes this stuff makes me like itchy because it's like when John Piper like talked about the ESV translation and it came out and it was like this is now the translation. This is the translation that you want to have. This is even more accurate without like slamming the King James Version, but also like in my head, that's where it all kind of like swirls around of like, it wasn't even an option until somebody else in the same kind of leadership circle started to say, oh, here's a different possibility.
All right, let's talk about that translation in a moment, because that's a good one to help us see that translations aren't neutral. So one of the things we talk about in our circles a lot is translation is commentary. And people who know another language at all, or even if you only took a few levels in high school, can start to get your mind around this when you think about those words that you come across in English, where you have to choose from a few choices in another language, or vice versa. And
Mhm.
especially when those things are just hard to pick the word that catches the tone.
Mm.
And you can't, and so you have to choose. That's how translation works. You have to choose a word, but you know that like it's not quite capturing the idea in the original language. That happens with any language. And now we're talking about ancient languages across culture and time and space. And it's very complicated to figure out how to say things in English. And a lot of those English words have weight. And then to recognize that the translations themselves often have an agenda, the ESV being one of the primary amongst them. So the ESV translation actually came about in 1997 because John Piper called for a new translation of the Bible. He actually was a part of calling
It
for it.
was swirling properly
Yes.
from
No, and because
97.
I looked this one up ahead of time because I was like, this is actually really helpful to talk about because people just pick up any, like, oh, which translation looks right from the shelf and don't know this sort of history. So it was aiming to be a more, quote, theologically sound and literal translation than the RSV, but it was
Literally what I was
specifically
told.
in order to be more quote unquote accurate, it was expressly complementarian in its worldview and translating it in a complementarian way. So, for instance, in Romans 16:1, instead of Phoebe being called a deacon, in the ESV, she's called a servant. Because that's quote unquote more accurate because the complementarian worldview wouldn't allow her to be a deacon. So let's translate that as servant instead. Now, is that the wrong, quote unquote, wrong translation? No, that is a possible translation of the word, but they're intentionally choosing servant because they're intentionally coming at it from a complementarian worldview. In Ephesians 5, and the passages about it makes sure that the submission is really clear. In Junia's role in Romans 16:7 is also changed to be more passive than the possibility of her being an apostle. And so ESV intentionally is complementarian, and then that's credited as being quote unquote more accurate. And this is
Okay,
what's happening in our translations.
just to do the due diligence of if someone is like, what do you mean by complementarian? I know that most people listening to this probably already know that, but for the one person out there who's downloading this podcast and is like, what are you talking about? What is complementarian? What is the alternative to complementarian? What else could there be? Can you just give us like the little 2 sentence complementarian versus whatever?
There's complementarian and egalitarian are two main positions. I'm sure those, like, we could consider them two ends
Spectrum.
of this. All of these things are a spectrum. So these aren't the only two positions on this. It's like primary, which is really about women's role in the home and women's role in the church. And complementarian would really hone in on ideas of submission. The female submits to the male in church leadership positions and in home positions. And that does, and a complementarian worldview, to be fair to them, they wouldn't say that's less equal. They would say it's different roles. It's
Mhm.
complementary roles. Whereas the egalitarian would say, we read the Bible as saying all roles are available to women and men. And when we're talking about the submission in the Bible, this is talking about something else. You can see that women like Junia and Phoebe are deacons and apostles. You can see that there are women in leadership. So there's not restriction of women in leadership in the egalitarian, and whether that leadership is in the home or in the church.
And this has played itself out in such stark ways throughout the history of the church, even to this day, where there are numerous denominations that will not ordain women, or they will cap the type of ordination that a woman can have compared to a man. So if there's levels of ordination, women can only go so far in those levels as opposed to a man can go further. And then also when you start talking about tying your faith with your politics, there are some who would even question, can you vote for a woman? Because if it's a spiritual calling to be in elected office, to be a leader of the nation or the leader of the state or whatever, can you put a woman over men? Like, could you put a woman over the military? Could you put a woman over the laws or over governing? Because that's not a place that women are quote unquote allowed to hold because the Bible says so.
Well, and even further than that, there are some calling that women shouldn't vote because they should trust their husband's vote. That would be a very complementarian view of a household, to say, no, you submit to what your husband has to say, and it's your husband's job to make sure you're on the same page in that view. But like the idea that somebody translated the Bible with that theology in mind and took out any, like, translated according to upholding that theology.
Can I just interject here really quick? Because you said that people don't think women should vote. And for some people out there, what I'm about to say will not be a surprise because they follow the news. Others are going to be like, what in the world are you talking about, Steph? Like, no one questions that. Actually, the secretary of the now newly named Department of War, Pete Hegseth, is a member of a church that is specifically calling for that to be the law of the land. And that church movement is growing in number because of the Christian nationalism movement happening in our country right now, that one of the people on the president's cabinet who is in charge of the military actually doesn't think women should vote. Now, I don't know if Pete Hegseth holds that position, but he definitely belongs to a church movement that does.
Well, and this is why translation matters, because then those churches probably are using the ESV translation, or maybe King James, but that was specifically written with the complementarian worldview in mind, so that it all lines up with the complementarian worldview, and you don't run across a verse that makes you question that worldview.
And to be fair, we all choose the thing that feels most congruent with what we want.
100%.
Yep.
So,
the churches that I go, they're
before
never
we-
going to read ESV because of that. They're going to be reading the First Nations version, or
So like
inclusive
this is
Bible.
It's
we're
true.
all swimming in it. It's not
Yep.
just one side is swimming in it.
Yep.
We're all swimming in it because like this, the text is complicated. It is really hard to take texts from a different language and a different time and pull them. We do see it in different spaces. Like, so I feel like this is actually where like Hollywood can be helpful in kind of trying to explain some of it, or like puts a lens on it differently.
Mm-hmm.
Like Shakespeare's really stood this like test of time in terms of like, this is something everybody studies, reads at least parts of it. And we still have like movie and films coming out trying to take a spin on what Shakespeare was doing.
Mm-hmm. You know, I do this as a pastor on Sunday mornings. I'm doing a sermon on the prodigal son, and I know that the word doulos, which is the word for slave, also the word for servant, is in that story, because the father is going to turn to the doulos and say, go kill the fatted calf, my son is home, bring the cloak, get the ring, give him sandals, right? And now when I'm reading that, and in English, I have to choose, am I going to read, and the father turned to the slave and said, go kill the fatted calf? Or am I going to read, and the father turned to the servant? Now, I'm going to make a theological decision or an interpretive decision that I don't want people getting hung up on slavery being emphasized in this story of forgiveness and reconciliation. And so I translate it servant, which I think is a fine translation. Also, if someone were to translate it slave, they would be accurate to the actual text as well. I make a decision based on theology, based on context. I like to think that maybe even if there was a slave situation going on, maybe they were treated more like servants. That's terrible, because if slavery is awful and we should never try to whitewash it away or make it seem less than what it is. But yes, so I will say that I do this too. And I like to think I'm doing it with intention, not because I'm trying to change the text, but because I'm trying to emphasize the true helpful meaning of what's going on. But again, I'm sure someone on the opposite side of the political spectrum or the theological spectrum is also doing the same thing.
Even the fact that you just said true and helpful.
I know, right? I hear
all
myself
my
saying,
radars were like,
"Ooh,
oh God.
I know. I hear it too.
What exists. Like this is like the tension in it is that there is slavery. And this is also where Dr. Wilda Gaffney she really helped me understand some of that, where we don't call them handmaids or maidservants. They are a womb slave. These women are raped. This is not the text is, the story underneath is still a part of the story.
Okay,
And
so
it
then
is,
what do we do? Because like I agree. I love that you've brought that up, and I think this isn't the first time we've talked about that
yeah.
terminology that Dr. Wilde Gaffney brings up, and like it is so helpful and it's so true. But what do we do with a story like the prodigal son, where we do have this word doulos that does mean servant, which carries a whole different level of connotations about relationship, but also can mean slave, which we know was also going on at the time. Both were happening. People had servants and people had slaves. We don't know, based on just one word, what was happening in a story that Jesus was telling that wasn't even recounting history. It was a parable. So, like, I think that's
So,
the question I have is what do we do with that? Like, because the point of the passage isn't what type of relationship the father had with the people at his home. It was the relationship he had with his son and what was going on there.
or it's
Mm,
about both.
mm,
And part of what we do with it is we have these kind of discussions. So like you're in a particular role where in a sermon you're going to have to choose. I can't talk about all the things that are in a passage. And so that's a
Right.
part of why you're making that
Right.
conscious choice.
Yeah.
I think one of the issues is for many people sermons are all they get.
True.
And so they're not in conversations wrestling with the text and the language that it uses in its original language that then can be translated in multiple ways, where the translation in front of us is choosing a word. The way that
Hmm.
we can hear multiple words is in, I'm going to just do a plug for 40 Orchards, in things like scripture circles. Well, we'll
Yeah.
talk about all these are all the ways it could be translated. How do you hear this passage differently when you translate it as womb slave as compared to handmaiden? um,
Hmm.
and then we can talk about it and not try to over resolve it
Hmm.
and leave that tension in there and wonder about that tension, because I think that's the issue that we're kind of talking about is translations tend to try to over resolve something from the perspective of the translators,
Hmm.
whether it's
That's
people going at let's try to make this more complementarian because that's my worldview, or I would say probably the inclusive Bible is doing the same thing and trying to make it overly inclusive because that's their worldview. And sometimes we run across like that's a more common translation in our circles, and sometimes I hear how it's translated, I'm like, that's really not very true. I think you should cross that out. In the same way I might say that to someone crossing out something in an IV, be like, oh, that's a problematic way that they translated that thing according to
okay.
their perspective, but at least it's clear
I,
they have a perspective with that being
yeah,
the title of the translation.
I mean, I kind of want to, I almost run a rabbit hole, but because partly I want to know, like, what do you think of the difference is between a servant and a slave?
Mm.
Like,
Mm,
what
sure.
would be the
Yeah.
difference in between them
That's a
two?
great question. Yeah.
And I think for me, like well, in our current setting of how we talk about slavery, I think that actually matters quite a bit. Because there's
Hmm.
a particular movement of folks that are looking at the history of America and saying, well, this wasn't bad. Everybody did it. And so there
They
is
learned
something.
something while they were in slavery, so therefore it was a benefit.
So I don't know that I don't know that I would want to like get rid of it. And I think it's interesting to sit in the perspective of it because most of us don't actually like a lot of the stories in the Bible. I mean, as much as like it's a story for us, we think, um, what, who are all the characters? Who are all the named folks that are in it? Or maybe they're
Yeah.
not named, but they are a player in the like most
Yeah.
of us don't have the leading person role. Most of us are moving about at a different speed. And so
Hmm.
sometimes even being able to see yourself in different parts of a story is helpful. Or to understand, like, oh, I actually can't relate to that story quite as much as I thought I was
Right.
because
Right.
I don't have that perspective. I don't understand how that
Yeah.
works. So I think this does point to the exact swirl of translation when we're trying to figure out what
Yeah.
words to use. We are translating. We are making decisions based on who we are, our lived experience, who we're speaking to, what is the point of the message. All of those things are in play when you're making translation issues. Like, yes, there's like a sciencey way of doing it, but there's still going to be a choice. Like more simply, that's not as big of a deal is whether it's the Lake of Galilee or Sea of Galilee. Either translation is perfectly acceptable. Most of us have only heard it as sea, but if you've been there,
It's not very big.
not very big. Doesn't really feel like a C. So like that's a simple one. Doesn't matter too much. But actually, in your imagination, when somebody says Sea of Galilee versus Lake of Galilee, you have a different idea. Especially, I suppose, in the Midwest. I don't maybe different in other parts of the world. But
I'm going to go back to the slave servant one for a minute, because I do think there's implications on it. Amy Jill Levine and her, I think it's in the book on the parables. I don't think it's in the annotated New Testament. Maybe it's in both. Her interpretation is not that the Father in the passage is God. She's like, there's a whole nother interpretation than the Father being God as the point of the parable. And I think one of the things it does to be like, wait, this individual has a slave, is it would say, oh, that feels wrong that it's God. But maybe that opens up to, well, what if it's not God? What if there's a whole nother interpretation of this parable besides the Father being God that I've never considered, that noticing that it's a slave helps me consider? And I think that's the kind of stuff, but it takes some time. It takes us sitting with the discomfort a little longer, because now we're uncomfortable because we're like, wait a second, isn't that the right interpretation of that parable? It feels good there's lots of books written about that. That's how I think about God. Okay, well, what if there's another possibility? And now we have some opportunity to think about that.
Yeah. I think this is really helpful because it feels like there's levels, right? So like level 1 is you don't question it. This is the only interpretation. That's the ESV. That's the King James issue that, Lisa was talking about running into. Second level down is like, oh, translations are different. Like we can wrestle with some of the translation differences and why they chose what they did and that kind of thing. Level 3 is, ooh, translation is kind of tricky and fun. And we get to ask some better questions because maybe if we backed away from the translation being right and accurate and actually said, oh, they're making a choice, now we get to decide how we're going to dance with it. But it's going to not just take a sermon on a Sunday. It's going to take a small group or a scripture circle wrestling with it with 40 Orchards. Now that's like a third level down of like really messing with it. Because I think so often I think people have moved on from being stuck at level 1 in most circumstances, but we are now at level 2, right? Like we're at the second level of, yeah, there's different translations. We could nuance things a little differently. And like, I get that that's what people in my life are going to be doing. They're going to, someone's going to prefer the NRSV. Someone's going to prefer this one. Someone's going to prefer the indigenous. Someone's going to prefer this. And like, that's great. We can all kind of have our preferred translation that helps us understand the Bible more. And so it's like, okay, can we get below that? Can we get into the wrestle of, okay, this word doulos means a lot of things. Like, what's that doing? And I think that's where the good is. Like that's where
It's also, there's a risk there too, because I notice sometimes in our circles, people then start to get frozen by the languages.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I don't know Greek, I don't know Hebrew, and now I know that it matters.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how to read the Bible at all because I don't trust anything the English says.
Yeah.
Or then I start looking to some quote unquote expert to translate it for me and assume that they're more right than the other translation I had.
Yeah. Or can I just name something that I fall into, and I think others that I swim in similar circles to, is there's this predominant translation that we've been handed down from like the Western European church. Like they're the only ones that get the title of theology. Everybody else has to nuance it by saying womanist theology, black theology, liberation theology. Anyway, we get this translation and we get it handed to us. And then if we're like a little uncomfortable or we don't love it or we just do some good study and we find out that, hey, actually, Amy Jill Levine says that we could translate this differently. Maybe we've mistranslated it. And it's almost like we're looking for the most bizarre translation possible to like freshen it up. And I'm not saying that means it's wrong, because sometimes like it's good scholarship that we should gravitate towards. But there are other times where I kind of feel like, okay, I've read a lot of scholars. You're the only one saying that. And I like it. But does anyone else agree with you, like that studies this? Because it feels like I'm going out on a limb here. And I don't know if that's really accurate. And again, we're getting into the what's right, what's true, what's accurate thing. And I'm using quotes for those that are not watching this on YouTube. And I think that's where I get a little nervous as a person speaking about this thing, is if I gravitate always to the person in the furthest margin of my camp, is that really is that am I also just getting in some dangerous, muddy theological biblical interpretation water?
Well, I don't know, it's dangerous.
That's always Lisa's voice. Is this really as dangerous as we think? Let's kick those tires.
I mean, like Christian
here
nationalism does this, and it's really dangerous. So
Yeah, but they would argue they have a lot of scholars that would support them. You wouldn't actually know that you're in dangerous territory because the cacophony of sound is so strong. So sometimes
yeah,
it's not that there's multiple voices that are affirming it that tell you that it's true. So like,
yeah.
who's controlling the narrative? But I think it's why.
Hold on, pause. Who's controlling the narrative is a really good question to think about with your translations, with your pastors. Just to pause when we think about what to do with it, just to pause and say, where is this narrative coming from? Is there an agenda to this translation? Is there agenda to this pastor? Okay, continue, Lisa.
Or to know that there is one and just kind of seek it out, or to ask a question.
To know what it is.
Who did the translating? Who did that? Because it may not be that these are like, there are some translations don't have Jewish folks doing Jewish translation. Anyway, I keep thinking about, like, one of the things that I loved learning about was like learning about feminist theology and then learning about womanist theology, because they are not the same. They're different. But it helped me like expand and question differently, because womanist and feminist scholarship, it was really looking at the role and voices of women inside the text. Was part of it's part of like where you'll see the most scholarship around, or looking at like violent texts. And what's helpful for me, like having experienced violence in the home growing up, it is helpful for me to have somebody wrestle with the violence in the text and to actually go after it and talk about it. And that's the thing that I think is beautiful, is that feminist and womanist theology oftentimes doesn't shy away from going after texts that are really quite harmful. And sometimes what I find in church settings is we don't actually address the harmful things. We jump over them. We pick the passages that are most comfortable, the ones that we can actually preach a good sermon about, that like, we don't tell the cautionary tales in the way that like actually owning some of the harmful things that are inside the text could offer us. That is why I like, when I think about the women who have come at, like, who just gone after the text, womanist theology in particular has gone after the text about rape of women, violence against women, and like talk about it. It doesn't mean that I have to go, oh, I completely agree with this, the way that they've done this. But it helps because there's not a lot of other places that are going to go after that, or not try to soften it and make it like something that it's not, instead of like letting it be a part of this text, because it's there, it's in it.
Well, and maybe that's where we go back to Jesus's question of what's in it and how do you read it, or how readest thou in today's translation, to recognize how translation really affects both of those questions. Translation affects what we see is there, like especially if we're not fluent in the original languages, and how we read it, like what the translation says is affected by how the translator read it. And then how we read it is affected by our own theology. And that what we move towards, or what we try to resolve versus what we try to wrestle with, is also embedded in both translation and sermons, and like what groups we're a part of. Are we going to move towards these things? Are we going to try to resolve them? And that sometimes when things are over resolved in the translation, that also hinders us from having those discussions, moving at the hard things. Like I think sometimes like people love the Message. Not everybody, but a lot of people love the translation of the Message, but there's some problems. I mean, Eugene Peterson, from what I can see, was actually he seemed like a really solid pastor, but he is a white male pastor from Canada, right? I think. So he's got a perspective, even if it's he's coming and he's one person. And as a part of what he was doing with the Message, a lot of it feels really good. but not all of the Bible actually feels good. But that's going to tend to be the translation that we choose is like, oh, I like this one. It feels good when I read it.
Mhm.
That's a
Well, and
different, go ahead.
I just wanna point out, like, I think we were using the word translation pretty generically, but we could nuance other language for what we're reading when we read the Bible. So there are translations, which is trying to take the original language and find an English equivalent and using those words. So the NRSV is a translation. It's trying to be as accurate to the Greek as one can be. The NIV, the New International Version, or the NLT, the New Living Translation, are transliterations. They're not trying to be accurate to the Greek. What they're trying to do is take a Greek phrase or a Greek sentence or a Greek paragraph and say, okay, what is this saying? Because clearly in English, we don't say it word for word like that. And even if we just rearranged it grammatically, it would sound clunky. Because if you put the NRSV and the NLT next to each other, one's going to feel clunky and one's going to feel so smooth to read that it's just easy. It just rolls. Because the NLT is not trying to be 100% accurate to the Greek or the Hebrew. It's trying to smooth it over to make it readable. That's a transliteration, not a translation. And so when we are using transliterations like the NIV or the NLT to use as our teaching devices, as our Bible that we teach from, we got to be a little careful because it's not actually trying to enter into the question of doulos, is it slave or is it servant? It's just trying to make the story easy and palpable for our modern context. And then the message is like an extreme version of a transliteration. It's even more like
One of the ways I've heard it
personal.
described is like, is it trying to be more word for word or thought for thought or idea for idea?
Yeah.
And that there's sort of a spectrum in those, but
And
and
the
that all
further
of those
you
can be
get,
biased.
but
Any of those can be
they
biased.
all can be biased, but the further away you get from a translation word for word, the more you're bringing your theology and your bias into it.
Right. I also just want to like note that we were talking about a purely like Western conversation because I just want to, for a moment, do we imagine that when people are translating it into Chinese, are they translating our English versions into Chinese or are they translating Greek and Hebrew into Chinese? Like,
I don't know.
we assume that everything, like the translation to English is the, there's still people who speak Greek.
But Koine Greek is not spoken anymore. The Greek of the
Biblical languages are mostly
gone.
not necessarily dead, but
Yeah.
Not spoken.
And like we actually understand some of the translation things, but we just don't think about it very often. That like the work of putting something into a different language is incredibly complicated. Like any of us who took Spanish or German or anything in our class, we understand that like, oh yeah, you're making some choices. How you ask things and the order you ask things changes, and you can
I
very
mean, this
easily
gets at
say
the
the wrong
thing.
thing.
Lisa, you brought this up last week, and it's exactly the right thing to have brought up last week, and we can bring it up this week. It's the difference between butt dial and booty call.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
you know, they're going to mean different things. They obviously mean very different things, but they're almost the exact same words.
So
And
across space and time.
yeah,
How
across
we
space and
interpret
time,
that.
it's going to get confusing, especially if you were translating. I mean, even right now, if you were to translate that into a different language, they might mess it up. Like right now,
Yeah.
if you were to go from English into French, they might mess it up.
Mm-hmm.
And someone would be like, whoa, what's wrong with having a butt dial at 2 a.m.? Like everybody has a butt dial. It'd be like, what? Everybody in France has butt dials? Like, because we're thinking it's booty call, right? Like everybody in France does booty calls at 1 a.m. That's like, wow. Well, I guess that lines up with my perspective of French people, but sorry, that was a low blow for French people.
So sorry. So sorry to
Oh,
France
sorry,
because
all you
we
people in
really have
France.
no place to judge anybody currently.
No.
Anyway.
I want to name, I mean, as a part of that sort of stream of thought about like word for word versus thought for thought kind of idea, one of the reasons I actually do like the New King James translation is I like that it doesn't try, like the these and thous aren't quite like, so it's not quite so hard to read. But one of the things that they're honest about in their translation is they italicize the words that weren't there in the original language. And
Mm.
I appreciate that level of integrity to translation to say, we're adding this one in to make this sentence make sense, but we're going to italicize it so that you know. I'm not aware of other translations that do that, but I really appreciate that because when you're reading in English, then you can just have sort of a visual cue that they're trying to translate something difficult, and so they're adding in some English words.
Well,
And
and
I
there
don't
are
even know for sure that they always do that, but they often do that.
Yeah.
And there are good study Bibles that, I mean, not all study Bibles are perfect, and I'm not saying that you have to read a study Bible, but there are a lot of study Bibles that will put a little note in the text. So, like when you do come across the word servant, if you look down below, it will say or slave. Like, I mean, so you can see that that word could be translated differently, and those are pretty prominent. And so I think those can be helpful ways if people are doing like a daily reading around the table with their grandfather. They can be like, well, Grandpa, I don't know if it actually means that because my study Bible that I'm looking at says this.
Mhm.
I that sort of I feel like transitions us into maybe like I feel like listeners might be like, well, great. Now what translation should I use? Because now I feel
I know.
lost. And one of the resources I want to recommend that we can put in our show notes is actually Bible Gateway. Has a bunch of Bible translations on it. Many people might be familiar with it from using it in some case, but it also, I believe, for any of the translation it has a place where you can read an about the translation that is in the words of the translators. What were we trying to accomplish with this translation? Knowing that about the translation you're reading is really helpful. Like I'm going to read from in the NIV's description of itself. It talks about the initial vision for this project was provided by a single individual, an engineer working with General Electric in Seattle by the name of Howard Long, who wanted to be able to translate, like talk to the Bible more easily with his friends. Like, how do we feel about a translation that became so popular being driven by this engineer who then
By
gathered
Howard.
what?
By Howard.
By Howard. And then it's a self-governing body of 15 biblical scholars was formed with the charge of responsibility for this version. And then to know nobody on that committee was a Jewish Hebrew scholar. It was all an evangelical body of scholars who are translating. Like, we can know those stories about our translations, and then you can still read the NIV, but it helps when you're reading it to know that this is the story of it. Like, know the story of the translation you're reading so that you can sort of filter it a bit or know what the biases might be in the translation. That's one recommendation I would have. Read the backstory of the translation you're reading. Any other recommendations for translations for our listeners?
I think it's always helpful to have at least a couple. It
Mhm.
just balance it because then you can at least see. Oftentimes, if you do two sides, two different ones, you'll see where they're translating. Like like some stuff is fairly obvious, y'all. Like some stuff is easy to translate. It's not super complicated, but there are choices. And so you can actually, when you have things side by side, you can kind of see, oh, and it just helps remind you that there's some things out there. And if one bothers you, get curious why it bothers you. What's happening?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add my little short. I like the NRSV because I like that it's trying to be accurate to the Greek, or the Hebrew. I don't love transliterations when I'm trying to unpack a passage, just because I feel that's doing a little bit more than I want it to do. But I will sometimes read them just to try to go, okay, this is really confusing. I need somebody to like make this a little bit easier for me to handle at the moment. And so it's nice just to tap into one. But then, like Lisa, like both of you have been saying, like multiple. Like I do like to go to a New King James or to an inclusive translation and go, okay, these are probably going to be a little different. Let's see where the differences lie, especially in a passage that I know is going to be controversial for the people that I'm pastoring. I want to see what different sides of the theological spectrum are doing with it, so that I can be honest with people about it, and bring it up. So
I'm going to add one more recommendation, I think, which is to say it out loud and to listen to it more often. I think there's a strong oral tradition with sacred texts of multiple religions, the Judaism and Christianity being amongst them, that sometimes we notice things differently when we're hearing them or when we're speaking them. We might see it or feel it or be more able to move towards that thing that's hard because our eyes can skip over it easier than our voices and our ears. So,
Can I add one more thing?
yes.
Like, that's a little bit like not part of the conversation, but maybe it's adjacent. We are talking about written translation, but for many, 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 many years, nobody had access to a written translation, and they only had artistic translation or visual translation or stories that were passed down translation. I think there's a whole study that we could do on other mediums of translation of the Bible. But one modern one that's recently been done is the St. John's Bible up at Collegeville at the Abbey in St. John's. And it is, for the first time in, I think, hundreds of years, they hand wrote the entire Bible and did many, many artistic renditions of different pictures with a modern sense of art and science being brought into things. And so if you're curious about a totally different exploration of scripture, I would recommend checking out the St. John's Bible. All you have to do is write St. John's Bible and it'll pop up first thing on Google. And it's an interesting, thoughtful approach to scripture that could create some good conversation or some good wrestling from time to time.
Well, and that's also a reminder of what Lisa mentioned earlier about how we're thinking about this in English and we're thinking about it very Western. And when you say that, what comes to mind is the tradition of Eastern Orthodox that has told the story in iconography for a long time. And how is iconography a different way of retelling the story than a translation? And what is it to just even see more than the physical text as the way of retelling the story of faith?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, again, the Bible didn't take place in America.
Wait, what?
In case people didn't know. It's actually in Palestine. Just to be clear, like we are in a different...
It also didn't take place in Europe, in England.
Crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Crazy.
This has been a 40 Orchards podcast. At 40 Orchards, our mission is to create circles for all people to wrestle through biblical text so that together we can expand each other's experience of what is sacred, whole, and good. We search through the lens of sacred possibility, assuming there is more to be discovered, questioned, and applied as we listen for how God is still speaking. You can learn more about 40 Orchards and sign up for a study by going to 40orchards.org. Our opening music is by Les FM. Our closing music is by NCR Music Vibes. Additional music is by 3 Music. Any references to books or other sources can be found in the show notes of this episode. Thank you for searching the sacred.